The hall of the Imperial Gallery looked like a cathedral dedicated to luxury. Imported crystal chandeliers cast a golden glow over the marble floors, polished so finely they reflected the guests' satisfied faces like a perfect mirror. The air conditioning kept the temperature crisp while waiters circulated, offering French champagne in crystal flutes. Every detail here cost more than most people earned in a year. Robert Miller adjusted the knot of his Italian tie and stared at the illuminated painting in the center of the stage. The modernist canvas, attributed to a master who had passed away decades ago, was the star of the night. Valued at $3 million, it would be the crown jewel of his private collection. At 52, Robert had built a real estate empire in New York. Every building sold, every tower erected on Fifth Avenue was a step up the ladder of prestige, and that painting would be the ultimate symbol that he had reached the top. It wasn't that Robert deeply understood art. To him, those abstract strokes in blue and gold were less about aesthetics and more about status. The piece would be displayed in his Upper East Side penthouse, and every visitor would comment on his taste and knowledge. Its authenticity was guaranteed by the Imperial Gallery itself, the most prestigious auction house in the country. Across the room, Marcus Sterling, the gallery owner, moved among the guests with the elegance of someone born into that world. Impeccable grey suit, silver hair slicked back, a smile that promised exclusivity. He stopped beside Robert and whispered with the intimacy of a man who sells dreams. "This piece will triple in value in 5 years. It's a sure investment, Robert. Besides, imagine the look on the Harrisons' faces when they visit your home and see this on the wall." Robert smiled. The mention of the Harrisons, his rivals in the real estate market, was the final push he needed. He had already decided, but the idea of outdoing that old money family made it even sweeter. The auctioneer stepped onto the small stage and adjusted the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have reached the main lot of the evening. This magnificent work, authenticated by our international experts, represents not just art, but history. We will start the bidding at $2,800,000. Robert raised his numbered paddle without hesitation. 2 others competed briefly, but dropped out when he surpassed $3 million. The auctioneer was about to strike the gavel when something unexpected happened. The gallery's double-glass doors swung open with a crash. The elegant murmur ceased instantly. Every eye turned toward the entrance, where a figure completely out of place was crossing the red carpet. It was a homeless man. His clothes were torn and filthy, a thick, matted beard covering a face weathered by the elements. He limped slightly, as if every step hurt, but his eyes held a determination that contrasted with his devastated appearance. The smell reached them first, a mixture of old sweat and forgotten streets. Exclamations of disgust and surprise echoed through the hall. A woman in a long gown covered her nose. A businessman instinctively stepped back, shielding his wife. The gallery security guards immediately moved toward the intruder, but he was faster. The man walked directly up to Robert Miller, ignoring the looks of repulsion and whispered insults. His eyes, fixed on the businessman, had a disturbing intensity. When he was less than 3 feet away, he spoke in a low voice, but clear enough for Robert to hear. "Don't spend your money. Everything here is a lie." The guards were already on him, grabbing his arms tightly. Marcus Sterling shouted from across the room, panic barely disguised in his refined voice. "Get this madman out of here immediately. Call the police." But Robert raised his hand, a gesture that froze everyone in place. There was something in that man's voice, a certainty that intrigued him. Maybe it was the intuition of someone who spent his life detecting bluffs in negotiations. Maybe it was just curiosity. He looked into the intruder's eyes and asked, keeping his voice steady despite the internal confusion, "How do you know anything about this?" The man smiled, revealing missing teeth and a look heavy with sadness and irony. His response turned the embarrassment into absolute shock. "I know because I'm the one who painted that picture, and every other one hanging on these walls." The silence that followed was deathly. Even the waiters stopped moving. Marcus Sterling went pale, his lips moving without making a sound. Robert felt the floor tremble beneath his feet. It made no sense. How could a beggar have any connection to the works of established masters? "You're delusional," Marcus shouted, finding his voice again. "This man clearly has mental issues." Security. Remove him now. But Robert didn't take his eyes off the intruder. Wait, he said with authority. I want to hear what he has to say. If it's a lie, we've lost nothing but a few minutes. Marcus protested, but Robert silenced him with a look. The businessman had built his fortune by trusting his instincts, and at that moment something told him this broken man knew exactly what he was talking about. The intruder looked around at the shocked and suspicious faces and began to speak. His voice, despite his miserable appearance, had an educated, almost professorial cadence. My name is Frank Collins. 20 years ago, I was the best art restorer in the country. I worked in the top museums in New York and Chicago. I could replicate any technique, any brushstroke. It was a gift, or so I thought. But life taught me that talents can be used for good or for destruction. Frank paused, his eyes filling with held-back tears. When my daughter became gravely ill, I needed money I didn't have. The experimental treatments cost a fortune. That's when he appeared. Frank pointed at Marcus Sterling, who was now visibly sweating despite the air conditioning. He offered me an absurd amount of money to use my skills differently. Not to restore old works, but to create new paintings that would be sold as lost masterpieces by dead artists. I was desperate. I accepted. The murmurs grew louder in the hall. Some people were already taking out their phones to record. Marcus tried to intervene again, but Robert made an imperious gesture for him to stay quiet. For years, I painted dozens of canvases. He provided me with antique materials, original canvases from the period, historical pigments. I studied every brushstroke of the masters I had to imitate. The forged documentation came later, provided by him and his network of international contacts. The works were sold to collectors who never questioned their authenticity because they trusted the reputation of this gallery. Frank walked slowly toward the painting being auctioned. The guards followed him, but Robert signaled for them to keep their distance. The man stopped in front of the canvas and pointed to a detail in the lower right corner. Look at this window here, in the background of the composition. The glass has a very specific ripple. No artist from that master's era would pay that much attention to such a detail, but I did. It was my invisible signature, a silent scream that this was a fake. He moved to another painting on the side wall, and in this one, look at the signature. Do you see that slight tremor in the last letter? The original artist had hands as steady as a rock, but I was shaking when I painted this because my conscience was already destroying me. An art expert present at the auction approached with a magnifying glass, examining the points indicated. His expression of skepticism slowly turned to horror. My God, he whispered. He's right. How did I not see this before? Frank continued his live forensic audit, pointing out subtle imperfections in work after work. Each revelation was like a bomb exploding the gallery's reputation. People began photographing the pieces, whispering among themselves, looking at Marcus Sterling with growing suspicion and fury. Robert watched it all with a mix of fascination and rage. He had been seconds away from spending $3 million on a forgery. His reputation would have been destroyed when the truth inevitably came to light. Why did you stop painting? Robert asked, his voice cutting through the rising chaos. Frank lowered his head and a tear finally rolled down his dirty face, because my daughter passed away anyway. And I realized I had sold my soul for nothing. I tried to stop, but he threatened me. He said he would destroy my reputation, that he would put me in prison, and he followed through on the threat. He ruined my life, pushed me into alcoholism. I lost my apartment, my legitimate work, everything. I ended up on the streets. And why come back now? Robert insisted. Frank looked through the gallery window at the New York night outside, then back at the businessman, because I was walking past the sidewalk when I saw through the window what was happening here. I saw another person about to be cheated, more dirty money moving on top of lies I created, and I couldn't just keep walking. Not this time. Marcus Sterling finally exploded. This is ridiculous. This man is clearly disturbed. Are you going to believe a homeless man over the decades-long reputation of this gallery? But his voice sounded desperate now, not authoritative. Robert took a step toward him, his eyes cold as steel. Then you wouldn't mind an independent audit, right? I have contacts in the best labs in the world. Carbon dating, chemical analysis of the pigments, the works. If these pieces are authentic, "You have nothing to fear." Marcus's face lost all color. His hands were visibly shaking, and in that moment of heavy silence, everyone in the room understood the truth. Marcus turned abruptly and ran toward the back exit. The gallery guards reacted on instinct, blocking the back exit before Marcus Sterling could reach it. The man who minutes ago personified elegance and control was now cornered against the wall, his impeccable suit soaked in sweat, his eyes wide with panic. "Don't let him leave," Robert Miller ordered in the same voice he used to close multi-million-dollar deals. "Call the police, now." One of the security guards already had a phone in hand. The hall had transformed into a cauldron of heated voices. Some guests demanded explanations. Others were already on the phone with their lawyers, and others simply filmed everything with expressions between shock and morbid excitement. The auction had become the scandal of the year. Frank Collins remained standing in the center of the hall, breathing heavily. The adrenaline that had sustained him during the revelation was beginning to fade, leaving him visibly exhausted. He leaned against one of the marble columns, his legs trembling. Robert approached him, and for a moment the two men stared at each other, one wearing a suit that cost more than a mid-sized car, the other in rags that barely protected him from the cold. But there was something equal in that gaze, a mutual respect born of shared truth. "You need to sit down," Robert said, surprising himself with the kindness in his tone. "Someone bring this man some water." A waiter hesitated, looking at Frank with thinly veiled disgust, but obeyed when Robert repeated the order firmly. Frank accepted the glass of water with trembling hands and drank in small sips, as if he wasn't used to receiving any kind of consideration. While they waited for the police, Robert made a decision. He turned to the crowd and raised his voice, commanding silence with his presence. "Everyone here was cheated by this gallery. I almost spent $3 million on a fraud. I imagine many of you have bought works here over the years. I suggest you hire independent experts to examine your collections, and you can be sure I will see this story through to the end." Marcus Sterling, still held between two guards, tried one last desperate move. "You're making a terrible mistake. This man is a liar, a disturbed soul. I have all the documentation, international certificates, verified provenances." Frank let out a bitter laugh. "I also thought the documentation would protect me from the guilt. But paper will accept anything, Marcus. You knew that better than anyone. Remember when you showed me how it worked? The forged stamps from Europe, the invented letters from dead collectors, the doctored catalogues. You turned lies into art." The gallery owner closed his eyes, defeated. In that moment, he was no longer the elegant predator, just a man who knew his life as he knew it was over. 15 minutes later, 3 police cruisers arrived. 2 detectives entered the hall, accompanied by forensic experts. The scene was surreal, one of New York's temples of luxury transformed into a crime scene. The lead detective, a man in his 40s named Henry Campbell, heard a summary of the situation from Robert and then approached Frank. "Are you willing to provide a formal statement regarding these accusations?" Frank nodded, his voice hoarse with exhaustion. "I am. I'll tell you everything. Names, dates, techniques, everything I know. I have nothing left to lose." "And what about you?" the detective asked, turning to Marcus. Marcus Sterling remained silent, only asking for his lawyer. Both were taken to the station, Frank as a cooperating witness, Marcus under custody. Robert insisted on accompanying them, along with his own lawyer, an efficient man named Dr. Arthur Vance, who arrived in less than 20 minutes. At the station, under the cold lights of the interrogation room, Frank began to tell his story in painful detail. He spoke about every work he had forged over the last 15 years. He described the secret workshop Marcus kept in an abandoned warehouse in Queens, where Frank worked in isolation, creating fake masterpieces. He had a perfect system, Frank explained, his voice monotonous with exhaustion. He would buy old canvases of worthless paintings at European auctions. He'd carefully remove the original paint and give me the blank canvas. The pigments were imported illegally, made with the same ancient formulas. Even the varnish was period accurate. Carbon dating would show the correct age of the canvas and materials. What it wouldn't show is that the composition was made decades or centuries later. "And the signatures?" the police expert asked. Frank smiled sadly. I studied each artist for months. I analyzed hundreds of authentic signatures until I could replicate the exact hand pressure, the angle of the pen, even the tiny imperfections that prove authenticity. But I always left a purposeful mistake, a mark that I was there, that it wasn't real. It was my way of screaming for help without compromising the operation. "Why didn't you report it sooner?" Detective Campbell questioned. "Because he had power," Frank replied, his voice breaking. "Marcus knew important people, judges, politicians, businessmen. He threatened me, saying that if I said anything, I would be destroyed. And when I tried to stop, he kept his word. He made sure I lost every legitimate job I had. He spread rumors that I was unstable, an alcoholic. And I became those things. The guilt and despair consumed me until I lost everything." Robert watched from a corner of the room, his thoughts in a whirlwind. He had spent his entire life accumulating status symbols, surrounding himself with expensive objects to validate his success. And there was a man who had a true talent, a rare gift, and who had been exploited and discarded like trash. The deposition lasted hours. When Frank finally finished, he was visibly drained. Detective Campbell leaned back in his chair and sighed. "Mr. Collins, you are aware that you also committed crimes, forgery, fraud, larceny. Even if you were coerced, you actively participated in these activities." Frank nodded. "I know. I'm ready to accept the consequences. I just wanted the truth to be known before I disappeared completely." It was then that Robert stood up and approached the table. "Detective, if I may, I'd like to say something." Henry Campbell nodded. Robert looked at Frank before speaking. "This man saved my fortune and my reputation today. He could have stayed on the streets, keeping this secret, letting more people be cheated. But he chose to do the right thing, even knowing it would hurt him. I will ensure he has the best defense possible, and I will testify on his behalf, describing exactly what I witnessed." Frank looked up, incredulous. "Why? You don't even know me." Robert sat down beside him. "Because today, you taught me something I had forgotten. That the real value of things isn't in the price tag or the famous signature. It's in the truth, in integrity. You lost everything by straying from that, but you had the courage to come back. That deserves respect." In the following weeks, the Imperial Gallery scandal dominated the headlines. Forensic audits confirmed that at least 43 works sold in the last 10 years were forgeries. The total value of the fraud exceeded $80 million. Marcus Sterling was formally charged with racketeering, grand larceny, and money laundering. He was held without bail. Frank Collins, on the other hand, was treated differently. His spontaneous confession, total cooperation with the investigation, and the mitigating circumstances of coercion weighed in his favor. His lawyer, appointed and paid for by Robert, negotiated a deal where Frank would perform community service and undergo psychological counseling, avoiding prison time. But the real change was just beginning. 2 months after the scandal, Frank was in a small rehabilitation center in Brooklyn. The place was simple but dignified, funded by a social organization that helped homeless people rebuild their lives. He had stopped drinking, was in therapy, and was slowly regaining a sense of purpose. That was where Robert visited him on a Saturday afternoon. Frank was in the center's garden, helping paint a mural with others in recovery. When he saw the businessman approach, he put down his brush and stood up, still unsure how to act around the man who had become an unexpected figure in his life. "How are you doing?" Robert asked, and there was genuine concern in his voice. "Better," Frank replied. "Cleaner, at least. I still have nightmares about everything I did, but I'm trying." Robert looked at the unfinished mural. It was a simple scene, children playing in a park. The brushstrokes were firm, full of life. "You have real talent, Frank, a talent that shouldn't be wasted hiding behind the names of dead men." Frank shrugged. "I don't know if I still know how to paint something of my own. I spent so much time imitating others that I forgot who I was." Robert pulled an envelope from his inner jacket pocket and held it out to Frank. "Then maybe it's time to rediscover." Frank opened the envelope with hesitant hands. Inside were legal documents and a key. His eyes widened as he read. "This is a lease for a studio in Chelsea," Robert finished. 2 years paid in advance. "Equipped with everything you need. Canvases, paints, brushes. all top quality, all legitimate. When you get out of here, if you want it, there's a place waiting for you to create your own work." Frank felt tears sting his eyes. "I can't accept this. It's too much." "You can and you will," Robert said firmly. "Consider it an investment. You have a rare gift, Frank. And I've learned that wasting true talent for the sake of lies is the worst kind of crime." Frank clutched the envelope to his chest, unable to find words. Robert placed a hand on his shoulder. "I want to see what Frank Collins can create when he's not hiding behind anyone. When you're ready, you paint. And I'll be your first buyer. Not for the signature, but because I value the story behind the canvas." That afternoon, as the sun set over New York, two men from completely different worlds sealed an unlikely friendship, built on the ruins of lies and the promise of new beginnings. 6 months had passed since that transformative night at the Imperial Gallery. Frank Collins stood before the glass door of the studio in Chelsea, the key trembling in his hand. The building was discreet, an old textile factory renovated to house creative spaces. 3rd floor, room 312. When he turned the key and pushed the door open, the smell of fresh paint and new wood greeted him like a hug. The space was wide, with floor-to-ceiling windows that let in natural light. New easels were organized next to shelves filled with materials. Tubes of paint in every imaginable color, brushes of various sizes, blank canvases of different dimensions. It was everything an artist could dream of. Frank walked slowly through the space, touching each object with reverence and fear. It had been so long since he had created something truly his own. For years, his skill had served only to copy, to hide behind dead geniuses. Now facing a blank canvas, he felt paralyzed. He sat on a stool in the center of the studio and just looked out the window. Down below, life in Chelsea moved at its own pace, people coming and going, each with their own dramas and dreams. Frank had left the rehab center a week ago. He had been clean for 4 months, the longest period of sobriety in years. But guilt still visited him every night in dreams, where he saw the fake works hanging in museums, deceiving people who genuinely loved art. The phone Robert had given him rang. It was a message from the businessman himself, checking in on his first week at the studio. Frank smiled slightly. In recent months, Robert had become more than an unexpected benefactor. He had become a friend, someone who called regularly, who visited for conversations that had nothing to do with art or business, just about life. Frank replied saying he was fine, but he didn't mention the creative block that was tormenting him. He didn't want to disappoint the man who had bet on him when everyone else saw him only as a criminal or a homeless man. For 2 weeks, Frank went to the studio every day. He organized materials, cleaned surfaces that were already clean, prepared canvases he didn't use. He knew he was procrastinating, but he couldn't take the first step. The blank canvas was both a promise and an accusation. It was on a rainy Thursday afternoon that something changed. Frank was looking out the window, watching the drops slide down the glass, when he saw a scene on the sidewalk across the street. A middle-aged man in dirty work clothes was sharing his sandwich with a stray dog. The gesture was simple every day, but there was a humanity in it that touched something deep inside Frank. Without thinking much, he grabbed a medium canvas and put it on the easel. He chose his brushes, prepared the paints, and for the first time in decades, he began to paint something that came from within, not from studies of old masters. His hands moved almost on their own. Broad strokes created the grey background of the rain and the wet asphalt. Finer details gave shape to the hunched man, the thin dog, the sandwich being split in half. The colors were somber, earth tones and greys dominated, but there were small touches of warmth, a soft orange in the streetlight, a cozy brown in the bread. Frank worked for hours, lost in that act of pure creation. When he finally stepped back, the sun was already setting. He looked at his work and felt something he hadn't experienced in a long time. It wasn't pride exactly. It was recognition. That painting was his, genuinely his. Every imperfection, every color choice, every brushstroke reflected his vision, his story, his pain, and his hope. He took a photo of the canvas and sent it to Robert with a simple message. "I did it." The reply came in seconds. "I'm on my way." 40 minutes later, Robert walked into the studio. He stopped in front of the still wet painting and stood in silence for a long moment. Frank waited anxiously. trying to read the businessman's expression. "It's powerful," Robert said finally. "It has a truth in it that no work I saw at the Imperial Gallery ever had. It tells a real story." Frank let out a sigh of relief he didn't know he was holding. "It's about finding kindness in the most unlikely places, about sharing the little you have." Robert nodded, understanding the deeper meaning. "How do you feel?" "Scared," Frank admitted, "but also alive. For the first time in years, I feel like I'm creating something that matters, even if it's small." "It's not small," Robert corrected, "and it's only the beginning." In the following weeks, Frank painted obsessively. Each canvas explored scenes of urban life he had witnessed during his years on the streets. A street vendor protecting his goods from the rain with his own body. A mother cradling her baby at a bus stop at night. Construction workers resting in the shade during their lunch break. They were moments most people ignored, but Frank had lived and observed them from the inside. His impeccable technique, refined by years of study and imitation, now served a genuine vision. The paintings were technically masterful, but also emotionally honest. There was no pretension or attempt to impress. There was only truth. Robert visited the studio weekly, always bringing something, a coffee, a book, silent company while Frank worked. During one of these visits, he made a suggestion. "I think it's time for other people to see this." Frank stopped painting, a knot forming in his stomach. "An exhibition?" "Not exactly," Robert said carefully. "I know a small gallery in Greenwich Village. The owner, Julian, is honest, passionate about real art, not just profits. He gives space to emerging artists or those who are starting over. I think he'd love to see your work." Frank hesitated. "What if people find out who I am?" "The forger from the Imperial Gallery." Robert put a hand on his shoulder. "Frank, you paid for your mistakes. You served your alternative sentence. You cooperated fully with the law. And, more importantly, you're creating something new, something true. Your story isn't just about the mistakes you made. It's about the courage to start over." It took 2 more weeks for Frank to agree. When he finally met Julian Brooks, the owner of the Lookout Gallery, he was surprised by the welcome. Julian was a black man in his mid-30s with dreads tied in a bun and a genuine smile. "Robert told me your story," Julian said as he examined the canvases Frank had brought. "And can I say it's exactly the kind of narrative that's missing in the art world. Everyone wants glamour and fame, but real art comes from real places, from lived experiences." He stopped in front of the painting of the man sharing the sandwich with the dog. "This one touched me especially. My mother raised me alone. She worked as a cleaning lady. She always shared our food with neighbors who had less. I see her in this canvas." Frank felt a warmth in his chest. "That's exactly what I wanted to convey. The beauty in small kindnesses." Julian turned to him. "I'll be straight with you, Frank. Your past might scare off some conservative collectors, but it can also be your strength. You have a unique perspective. You've lived at both the top and the bottom of society. That gives a depth to your work that few artists can achieve." "So you'll agree to show my work?" Frank asked, hardly able to believe it. "More than that. I want to do a solo exhibition dedicated to your work. We'll call it Rebirth. Perspectives on starting over or something like that. Let's tell your story, Frank. The real one, without hiding anything. People deserve to know where this art comes from." Frank looked at Robert, who was smiling discreetly. He felt tears threaten, but this time they weren't from shame or despair. They were from gratitude and an emotion he couldn't name, something between hope and possibility. "Let's do it," he finally said, his voice firm. In the following months, Frank worked tirelessly to prepare enough pieces for the exhibition. Julian helped him write an honest artist statement about his journey. Robert, in turn, used his contacts to ensure the exhibition received media attention, but in the right way, focusing on transformation and talent, not just the scandal. The opening was set for a Friday in September. The night before, Frank could hardly sleep. He was afraid no one would show up. He was afraid people would judge him only for his past. He was afraid he wasn't good enough. But when he arrived at the Lookout Gallery that opening night, his worries dissolved. The space was full. There were art critics, collectors, students, ordinary people who had read about the exhibition on social media. and everyone was looking at his paintings with genuine attention. Frank moved through the space, hearing fragments of conversation. A young woman commented on the humanity portrayed in each face. A couple discussed the impeccable technique that didn't overshadow the emotion. A veteran art critic told a colleague that this was the kind of work missing from galleries, art that spoke about real life. Robert appeared beside Frank, 2 glasses of juice in hand. He still didn't drink alcohol around his friend, a gesture of respect Frank never mentioned but always noticed. "Do you see?" Robert said. "They're not seeing a forger, they're seeing an artist." Frank looked around at the people appreciating his work, and for the first time in many years, he felt that maybe, just maybe, he deserved a second chance. Saturday morning brought a surprise Frank never expected. Julian called early, his voice vibrating with excitement. "Frank, you have to see this. The exhibition is all over the city's art blogs. And there's more. We sold 5 pieces last night." Frank was having coffee in his small apartment, a modest studio he had rented with the money he started earning by teaching painting techniques at community centers. He almost dropped his cup when he heard the news. 5 pieces? In one night? "And there are people asking about the others," Julian continued. "Frank, I think you've really touched on something important. People are responding to your work in a way I rarely see." When Frank arrived at the gallery that afternoon, there was a small crowd. Some people were taking photos of the paintings, others were making notes in journals. A group of art students was talking excitedly about the techniques he had used, but it was one specific visitor who caught his attention. A woman in her 60s was standing in front of the painting, showing a mother cradling a baby at a bus stop at night. She had tears silently streaming down her face. Frank approached carefully. "Sorry to bother you. May I ask what you're feeling?" The woman turned, wiping her tears with a handkerchief. "Are you the artist?" Frank nodded. "I'm Frank Collins." She shook his hand firmly. "My name is Helen. I was that woman in the painting. 30 years ago, I took 3 buses every day to work as a nurse in a public hospital. My son was a baby, and many nights I came back so late that I could only give him attention in those moments of waiting. You captured exactly what I felt, the exhaustion, but also the love." Frank felt a lump in his throat. "That's what I want to paint about. The moments no one notices, but that are so important." "You did it," Helen said. "And please keep going. The world needs to see these stories." That conversation stayed with Frank for the following days. He realized his art had the power to touch people not through impeccable technique, but through emotional truth. It was the opposite of everything he had done as a forger, where technical skill served to deceive. The exhibition lasted a month and was a success beyond any expectation. 14 of the 20 works were sold. Critics praised the brutal honesty and technical mastery. Some online publications ran stories about his journey of redemption, but it wasn't all roses. A traditional art magazine published an article questioning whether a confessed forger deserved the spotlight. The text argued that giving Frank a platform was disrespectful to honest artists who had never deceived anyone. Frank read the article sitting in the studio, feeling the familiar sting of shame. Robert, who was visiting, noticed the change in his expression. "What is it?" Frank showed him the article. "Maybe they're right. Maybe I don't deserve this second chance." Robert read the text and sighed. "Frank, there will always be people who can only see your mistakes, but you know what matters. People like Helen, who saw your paintings and recognized themselves. The students who are learning that art can come from honest places. You can't control what everyone thinks, but you can control who you choose to be now." Frank absorbed the words. "You're right, I can't change the past, but I can make my present count." It was then that Frank made an important decision. He called Julian with a proposal. "I want to use part of the money I earned from the sales to create something special. Free art workshops for homeless people and those in recovery. Teach basic techniques. Provide materials. Give them a way to express themselves." Julian was silent for a moment, then his voice came back, emotional. "Frank, that's brilliant. And I know a space we can use. A non-profit I volunteer for has a large room that's empty on weekends." And so the street art project was born, a name with a double meaning that Frank chose on purpose. The first workshop took place on a rainy Saturday in October. Frank was nervous, preparing paints and brushes, not knowing if anyone would show up. 15 people arrived. Some were homeless, others were in recovery from addiction, others were simply low-income people who had never had access to art classes. Among them was a man named Paul, in his 40s, whom Frank recognized immediately. "I know you," Paul said, smiling with missing front teeth. "We used to share leftovers from the market at Union Square. You gave me a blanket once." Frank felt a wave of emotion. "I remember you, Paul. How are you doing?" "Better. I got a spot in a shelter and I'm working as a helper in a bakery, but I still pass by here sometimes. When I saw the poster about free painting classes, I thought it would be cool to try something different." That first workshop was transformative. Frank taught basic composition and color techniques, but what really happened was something bigger. People began to open up, sharing stories while they painted. A woman painted the house she had lost. A young man portrayed the face of the mother he hadn't seen in years. Paul created a simple but powerful scene of a sunset he had seen from the bakery window. At the end of the class, when everyone had left, Frank stood alone, looking at the paintings drying on the walls. None of them had the technical perfection he had spent decades honing, but all of them had something his forgeries never had: a soul. Robert appeared at the door, as if he knew Frank would need company at that moment. "How did it go?" Frank smiled, a genuine smile that lit up his weathered face. "It was perfect. You know, for years I used my skill to create beautiful lies. Today, I helped people create imperfect truths, and that is worth infinitely more." The workshops became a constant in Frank's life. Every Saturday he arrived early, prepared the space, and welcomed his students. Some came once and never returned. Others became a constant presence. Paul in particular showed a surprising talent. One afternoon, 3 months after the workshops began, Paul showed Frank a painting he had just finished. It was a portrait of Frank teaching, seen from behind, his hand guiding a student's hand. "It's you, teacher," Paul said shyly. "You always say art is about seeing people. I wanted to show you how we see you." Frank had to turn his head to hide the tears. No one had ever painted him before. For years he had existed in the shadows, invisible except when he was copying dead geniuses. Now, someone had deemed him worthy of being the subject. "Can I keep it?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion. Paul nodded, beaming. "It's yours." That painting ended up on the wall of Frank's studio, right next to his own works. It became his daily reminder of why he kept going, a sign that his life now had a purpose greater than fame or money. Meanwhile, the scandal at the Imperial Gallery continued to send shockwaves through the city. Mark Taylor had been sentenced to 8 years in prison and the total forfeiture of his assets. Dozens of collectors had filed lawsuits to recover the money paid for the forgeries. The American art world was in an uproar, with new regulations being implemented to prevent similar frauds. Frank was called several times as an expert witness in related cases. His expertise, once used to deceive, now helped unmask other forgery schemes. Ironically, he became a respected authority on art authentication. During one of these hearings, Frank came face to face with Mark for the first time since that night at the gallery. The man had aged drastically in less than a year. His hair was completely white, his face etched with deep wrinkles. When their eyes met, Mark looked away, but before the guards led him out, he whispered something that only Frank heard. "You were lucky to find an angel. I only found demons." Frank didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. He understood that they had both made choices, faced consequences, and followed different paths after the fall. Mark had chosen bitterness. Frank had chosen redemption. That night, back at the studio, Frank started a new painting. It was different from anything he had created before. It showed 2 figures on opposite sides of a bridge, one walking toward the light, the other moving away into the darkness. There were no defined faces, only silhouettes, but the message was clear. When Robert saw the work a few days later, he stood in silence for a long time. "It's about choices, isn't it?" he finally said. Frank nodded. "We all reach moments where we can choose what to do with our mistakes. We can turn them into something better or let them destroy us. I almost chose the darkness. But you showed me there was another way." Robert placed a hand on his friend's shoulder. I only offered the opportunity, Frank. You're the one who chose to walk toward the light. Every day, you make that choice again. That's what courage looks like. The two men stood there in comfortable silence, contemplating the painting that represented both the journey behind them and the promise of a better future, built not on perfect lies, but on imperfect, precious truths. A year and a half had passed since that night at the Imperial Gallery. Frank Costa was in his studio, preparing for his second solo exhibition. This time the show would be at the Lookout Gallery itself, but with a larger space and higher expectations. The theme was Reconstruction, a series of paintings documenting his journey from the streets to his rebirth as an artist. Word had spread through the city's art circles. Journalists were asking for interviews. Collectors were booking times for the opening night. There were even rumors that a major gallery in New York was interested in representing him nationally. But Frank was restless. It wasn't nerves about the exhibition. It was something deeper, a feeling that there was a story still untold, a wound still unhealed. Robert noticed his friend's agitation during one of his weekly visits to the studio. The two had developed a comfortable routine, sharing coffee and conversations that drifted between art, business, and life. "Are you worried about the show?" Robert asked, sitting in one of the studio chairs. Frank stopped mixing paints and sighed. "It's not the show, it's just that I've been thinking a lot about my daughter lately." It was the first time Frank had mentioned his daughter to Robert since that night at the police station. Robert leaned forward, attentive. "You never told me much about her." Frank set his brush aside and walked to the window, looking out at the city below. "Her name was Sophie. She was everything to me. Smart, funny, full of life. When she got sick, I would have done anything to save her. That's why I accepted Mark's proposal." His voice cracked and he had to pause before continuing. "The experimental treatments in the specialized clinics cost a fortune. I painted 15 forgeries in 6 months, working day and night. Mark paid me well, but never enough. He always found excuses to reduce the promised amount, saying sales were slow or buyers had complained." Frank turned to Robert, his eyes glistening with held-back tears. "Sophie passed away when she was 17, and I realized too late that Mark had been playing me from the start. He made millions off my paintings, but paid me just enough to keep me desperate and working. When I confronted him, he threatened to expose everything if I didn't keep going." Robert sat in silence, processing the raw pain in his friend's voice. "I'm so sorry, Frank. I can't imagine what you went through." "The worst part," Frank continued, "is that I never really got to say goodbye. In Sophie's final months, I was always in that secret warehouse painting. I thought I was saving her, but I was actually pulling away from her, and after she was gone, the guilt consumed me. I started drinking to forget, to stop feeling. By the time Mark discarded me, I didn't have the strength left to fight." Frank walked over to a stack of canvases in the corner and brought one into the light. It was a painting Robert had never seen, kept hidden from view. It showed a young girl reading a book under a tree, the sun filtering through the leaves and illuminating her face in golden tones. "I painted this from memory," Frank said softly. "It's the last happy memory I have of her, the summer before she got sick. She was reading Mark Twain and laughing at his ironic observations. I wanted to preserve that moment forever." "It's beautiful," Robert said, genuinely moved. "Why have you never shown it?" Frank put the canvas back. "Because it still hurts too much, and because I feel like a hypocrite painting memories of her when I wasted so much of the time we actually had." "You're not a hypocrite," Robert said firmly. "You were a desperate father trying to save his child. You made bad decisions for understandable reasons. That doesn't erase your love for her." Frank nodded slowly, wiping his eyes. "I wish I could apologize to her. Tell her I understand now that what she needed wasn't money for miracle treatments, but me, my presence." "Then paint that," Robert suggested. "Include this piece in the show, and paint others about her, about what you learned, about love and loss. People need to see this part of your story too." Frank hesitated. "It's so personal." "True art is personal," Robert replied. "You taught me that." In the following days, Frank plunged into a period of intense and emotionally exhausting creation. He painted memories of Sophie, some happy, others painful. One canvas showed her hands, still small, painting with watercolors at the kitchen table. Another captured her last birthday, when she blew out the candles knowing she likely wouldn't see another. The most powerful of all showed Frank from behind, hunched over a fake canvas in the secret warehouse, while in the shadows, almost invisible, Sophie's silhouette appeared in the doorway, waiting for attention that never came. When Julian saw the new works, he was visibly moved. "Frank, these are the most honest paintings you've ever created. They're going to devastate people, in the best way possible." "You think I should include them?" Frank asked, still uncertain. "Definitely. They complete your story. They show not just where you came from, but why. And they show that redemption isn't just about success, but about facing our deepest pains." The exhibition was set for a Friday in early spring. 2 days before the opening, something unexpected happened. Frank was in the studio when he received a call from an unknown number. "Hello?" "Frank?" The voice on the other end was female, trembling. "My name is Beatrice. I was Sophie's best friend." Frank felt his heart race. "Beatrice. Sophie talked about you all the time." "I know it might seem strange for me to call after all this time," Beatrice continued, "but I saw in the papers that you're having an exhibition, and there's something I think you should know, something Sophie asked me to keep for you." "What is it? Can I meet you?" "It's better in person." Frank agreed immediately. They arranged to meet at a cafe near the studio that afternoon. When Frank arrived, he recognized Beatrice instantly. She had grown up, of course, now a woman in her late 20s, but she had the same kind eyes he saw in the old photos with Sophie. They sat down, and Beatrice pulled a yellowed envelope from her bag. "Sophie gave me this 2 weeks before she passed. She made me promise I would only give it to you when I felt the time was right. I didn't know when that would be, but when I read about your exhibition, about your recovery, I knew it was now." Frank took the envelope with trembling hands. Inside was a letter, written in Sophie's delicate handwriting. He began to read, and tears immediately blurred his vision. "Dear Dad, if you're reading this, it means I'm already gone, and that somehow you found your way back. Beatrice promised to keep this until she felt you were ready to receive it. I know about the paintings, Dad. I know you were doing something you shouldn't have to try and save me. I found out when I overheard you and that man arguing on the phone. You thought I was asleep, but I heard everything. I want you to know that I never blamed you. You did what you did out of love, and that's all that matters. But I also want you to know that what I always wanted wasn't expensive treatments or miracles. It was just you. Our conversations, your stories, the way you taught me to see the world through an artist's eyes. I know that when I'm no longer here, you're going to feel guilty. I know you, Dad. You'll blame yourself for every moment you spent working instead of being with me. Please don't do that. Don't waste the rest of your life carrying that weight. Instead, paint. Paint true things, honest things. Paint the beauty you taught me to see. And when you look at your work, remember that a part of me will always be there, because you gave me the eyes to see the world that way. I love you, Dad. I always have, and I always will. And wherever I am, I'll be rooting for you to forgive yourself and find happiness again. With all my love." Sophie. Frank couldn't finish reading without letting out the sobs he had repressed for years. Beatrice gently placed her hand over his, allowing him to feel everything. "She made me promise one more thing," Beatrice said when Frank finally regained some composure. "That I tell you to use your real talent, not to hide behind other artists. She said you had a voice of your own that the world needed to hear." Frank wiped his face, holding the letter as if it were the most precious treasure. "Thank you, Beatrice. Thank you for keeping this, for knowing when the time was right." "She gave me a gift too," Beatrice shared. "She taught me that true love is wanting the best for someone, even when you can't be there to see it. I think she wanted to teach you the same thing." That night, Frank went back to the studio and created one more painting. Unlike all the others, this one didn't show a specific moment, but a feeling. It was abstract, with warm colors flowing and intertwining like invisible embraces. In the center, a small golden figure seemed to be dancing in pure light. When Robert saw the work 2 days later, on the morning of the exhibition opening, he understood immediately. "It's her, isn't it?" Frank nodded. "It's her forgiveness. And maybe, finally, my own." The piece was titled, Where Love Remains. The opening night of the reconstruction exhibition arrived with a gentle spring breeze that carried the scent of cherry blossoms blooming in the streets of Chelsea. The lookout gallery was transformed, its white walls now housing Frank Costa's complete journey from darkness to light. Frank arrived an hour before the official opening, wearing a simple suit that Robert had insisted on buying for him. It wasn't flashy like the ones he had seen at the Imperial Gallery on that fateful night, but it was dignified, comfortable, and real, just like everything in his new life. Julian greeted him with a hug. Ready? Frank looked around at the paintings that exposed his soul in ways he had never allowed before, the works about the streets, about new beginnings, about Paul and the other students, and in the center of the main room, specially lit, the paintings of Sophie. "I am," he replied, and for the first time in a long time, he truly believed it. The first guests began to arrive. Frank recognized familiar faces from the previous exhibition, but there were many new ones too. Art critics from major publications, collectors who had traveled from other cities, young students whose eyes shone with admiration. Helen, the woman who had cried before his painting at the first show, arrived with her adult son. She hugged Frank warmly. "I brought my son, Ralph, to see your work. I wanted him to meet the artist who can paint the truth of ordinary lives." Paul was there too, accompanied by other students from the street art project. They stayed close together, a bit intimidated by the sophisticated environment, but with visible pride on their faces. Paul had brought his girlfriend, a young woman named Carla, who was also a student in the workshops. "Teacher," Paul said, pointing to one of the walls, "is that one me?" Frank smiled. It was one of the most recent paintings, showing Paul teaching a child how to hold a brush. "It is you. You've become a teacher too, Paul. You deserve to be portrayed." Paul wiped his eyes quickly, moved. His students had become his extended family, and seeing them there, celebrating his success, meant more than any glowing review. Robert arrived with his wife Claire, an elegant woman Frank had met a few months prior. She was completely different from what Frank had imagined a wealthy businessman's wife to be. She was a psychologist who worked with underprivileged children, and she had embraced the friendship between the two men with genuine joy. "Frank," Claire said, kissing his cheek, "Robert hasn't stopped talking about this show for weeks. I'm so excited to see everything." "There's one painting in particular I want you both to see first," Frank said, leading them to the main room. When they stood before Where Love Remains, Claire held Robert's hand, visibly touched. Robert stood in silence for a long moment, absorbing every detail of the abstract work that somehow conveyed such concrete emotion. "You did it, Frank," he finally said. "You turned your pain into something that will touch people for generations." The gallery filled up. Animated conversations echoed through the space. Camera flashes captured the works. Critics took notes. And in the middle of it all, Frank circulated, answering questions, sharing stories, finally allowing himself to be seen. That was when an unexpected figure appeared at the door. It was a man in his 50s, in a discreet but well-tailored suit, with a serious expression but kind eyes. He introduced himself as Marcus, a curator from the Museum of Modern Art. "Mr. Costa, I came specifically to see your exhibition. I've been following your work for months, and I must say what you've created here is extraordinary." Frank felt his heart race. A curator from MoMA was talking to him. "Thank you, sir. That means a lot coming from you." Marcus observed the paintings around him before continuing. "We are organizing an exhibition for next year on art and redemption, exploring artists who transformed difficult experiences into meaningful works. We would very much like to include your work. It would be a group show with 6 other contemporary American artists." Frank had to lean discreetly against the wall. An exhibition at MoMA. It was something he had never dreamed of, not even in the days when he was painting under famous pseudonyms. "It would be an honor," he managed to say, his voice trembling. "Excellent," Marcus smiled. "My assistant will be in touch in the coming days to discuss details. But I want you to know that your story, your honesty, is exactly the kind of narrative that contemporary art needs." As Marcus moved away to look at more works, Frank had to step into the small office at the back of the gallery to process the moment. Julian followed him. "Are you okay?" Frank laughed, a sound between joy and disbelief. "Julian, is this real? Is all of this actually happening?" "It is, my friend, and you deserve every second of it." The night continued in a whirlwind of emotions. More works were sold. Journalists asked for interviews. Art students asked questions about techniques and inspirations. At one point, Frank found himself in the center of a small group, telling the story of how he had gotten there, from the night at the Imperial Gallery to that very moment. That was when someone in the group asked something that made him pause. "Mr. Costa, do you regret making those forgeries?" Silence spread through the room. It was the question everyone wanted to ask, but hesitated to. Frank thought carefully before answering. "I deeply regret deceiving people, participating in fraud, and using my talent dishonestly. But I cannot say I regret trying to save my daughter, because that love was real, even if my choices were wrong. What I've learned is that regret without action is just sadness. Regret that moves you to change, to repair, to grow, that is transformation." Spontaneous applause echoed through the space. Frank noticed there were tears in the eyes of several people. Later that night, as the gallery began to empty, Frank found himself alone for a moment before the painting of Sophie reading under the tree. He gently touched the canvas as if he could reach her through time. "I hope you're proud," he whispered. "I'm sure she is," said a voice behind him. It was Beatrice who had arrived later. Beside her was a man Frank didn't know. "Frank," Beatrice said, "this is my husband, Daniel, and there's someone else I'd like you to meet." A little girl of about 5 stepped out from behind Daniel's legs, looking at Frank with curious eyes. "This is Mr. Frank," Beatrice said, kneeling beside the girl. "The artist I told you about." The girl held out a crumpled piece of paper. "I made a drawing for you." It was a child's drawing, simple lines of a house with flowers and a bright yellow sun. In the corner, in crooked letters, it said, "For Mommy's friend." Frank accepted the drawing as if it were the most precious thing in the world. "It's beautiful. Thank you so much. Her name is Sophie," Beatrice said softly. "Named after my best friend. And maybe when she grows up, you can teach her to paint too." Frank had to kneel because the tears were falling freely now. "It would be the greatest honor of my life." The night ended with a small group gathered in Frank's studio. Robert and Claire, Julian, Paul and Carla, Beatrice and her family, Helen and her son, people who had entered his life in unexpected ways and had become his chosen family. Robert raised a glass of juice, keeping his tradition of not drinking alcohol around Frank. A toast to the bravest man I know, who had the strength to fall, the humility to ask for help, and the persistence to rise again. "No," Frank corrected, raising his own glass. "A toast to all of you, because no one reconstructs themselves alone. Each of you was a different brush helping to create this new version of me." The glasses clinked, laughter filled the space, and for the first time in years, Frank felt something he had forgotten the taste of: complete peace. 6 months later, Frank was at the Museum of Modern Art, his section of the Art and Redemption exhibition open to the public. The central piece was a new painting, created specifically for the show. It showed an art gallery seen from the outside, through a window. Inside, elegant figures observed works on the walls. But the focus of the painting was a man outside the window, looking in, his reflection blending with the scene inside. And in the reflection, subtly, one could see not the man in rags he had been, but all the versions of him at once: the talented restorer, the desperate father, the tormented forger, the fallen man, and finally, the reborn artist. The title of the work: The Moment Before the Truth. Robert was standing beside him that Saturday afternoon, looking at the crowd appreciating the works. "You know what's ironic?" Robert said. "That night at the Imperial Gallery, I was about to spend $3 million on a perfect forgery. Now I look at that painting you did for me, the one of the auction scene, and I wouldn't trade it for all the old masters in the world. Because that painting isn't perfect, it's true." Frank smiled. "And that's the biggest difference, isn't it? Perfection can be copied. Truth has to be lived." The two men stood there, watching people of all ages connect with the works. They saw tears, smiles, and animated discussions. And Frank understood that this was the legacy he should have always sought. Not fame for imitating others, but the ability to touch hearts by being authentically himself. As the afternoon sun flooded the museum with golden light, Frank thought of Sophie, of all the people who had helped him, and of all the mistakes that had brought him there. And for the first time, he didn't wish to change the past, because every fall, every error, every moment of darkness had been necessary to create the man he was now. Across the room, Paul was explaining his own artistic journey to a group of interested young people. Julian was talking to other curators about future artists to promote. Helen was showing the paintings to grandchildren she hadn't known during the first exhibition. Beatrice held little Sophie's hand while explaining the colors. Robert placed his hand on Frank's shoulder. Ready for the next chapter? Frank looked around one last time, etching that moment into his memory, and then smiled at his friend. Always. Because he had learned the most important lesson of all. Life wasn't a canvas you painted once and were done with. It was a work in constant creation, always unfinished, always being reconstructed, and the true art lay in never giving up on adding new colors, new strokes, and new stories. On his way out of the museum, Frank stopped in front of a sign announcing free art workshops for the community, a program the museum had started partially inspired by the street art project. He smiled, knowing his work was creating ripples larger than he had ever imagined. And as he walked through the streets of the city on that golden afternoon, surrounded by friends who had become family, Frank Costa finally understood what his daughter had tried to teach him in that letter. Love remains. True art remains, and the ability to start over, to create beauty from ruins, that was the ultimate masterpiece that every human being could paint on the canvas of their own existence. End of story. If Frank Costa's journey touched your heart as much as it touched mine while telling it, you are not alone. This story is a reminder that it is never too late to change, to choose truth over perfection, and to turn our mistakes into lessons that light the way for others. We have many other moving stories about new beginnings, second chances, and the extraordinary strength of the human spirit waiting to be told. If you want to continue this journey with us, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Leave a like and share in the comments which part of Frank's story moved you the most. Your story of overcoming challenges matters too, and we would love to hear it. Until the next story, keep believing that every life can be a masterpiece in reconstruction.